The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road leading into Cedar Ridge, Colorado, as a figure emerged from the heat haze like a mirage. At first glance, it appeared to be a woman walking slowly, deliberately, but as the shape grew clearer, the full picture revealed itself. Rebecca Hayes moved with the careful gait of someone nursing both physical and emotional wounds, her left arm cradled protectively around a bundle that occasionally shifted and whimpered. Behind her, connected by a makeshift rope halter, limped a young colt whose coat was matted with dried blood and whose eyes held the same wariness that reflected in the woman's face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1892 had been unforgiving to the Colorado Territory, and the drought had left the landscape painted in shades of brown and gold. Dust devils danced across the prairie, and the few remaining wildflowers hung their heads in defeat against the relentless heat. Rebecca's dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now stained with sweat, dirt, and something darker around the hem. Her auburn hair, partially escaped from its pins, caught the light as she paused to adjust her grip on the 3-year-old girl in her arms. Little Emma stirred against her mother's shoulder, her small face flushed with fever and exhaustion. The child had been crying intermittently for hours, but now seemed too depleted even for tears. Her tiny fingers clutched at the fabric of Rebecca's dress, seeking comfort that her mother desperately wished she could provide. Behind them, the colt stumbled slightly, favoring its right front leg where a jagged wound ran from knee to hoof. The events of the past week played through Rebecca's mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from, the fire that had consumed their small homestead outside Denver, the loss of her husband Thomas to consumption just 3 months prior, the creditors who had circled like vultures, demanding payment for debts she never knew existed, the hasty packing of their few remaining possessions into a single carpet bag, the journey by train as far as their meager savings would take them, followed by the desperate decision to walk the remaining 30 miles to Cedar Ridge, where Thomas had once mentioned a distant cousin might offer temporary shelter. But it was the attack 2 days ago that had changed everything. The 3 men on horseback had emerged from a cluster of cottonwoods near a dried creek bed, their intentions clear from the moment they spotted a woman and child traveling alone. Rebecca had managed to grab Emma and hide behind an overturned wagon, but not before witnessing the men's cruel sport with the wild horses they had been pursuing. The young colt, barely more than a yearling, had been separated from its herd and injured in their rough handling. When the men finally rode off, laughing and shouting, they left behind a scene of casual cruelty that made Rebecca's stomach turn. She had found the colt standing on 3 legs, blood trickling from a gash that looked deliberately inflicted. Its eyes, wide with terror and pain, had met hers across the small clearing. In that moment, looking at the wounded animal, Rebecca saw her own reflection. Both of them were alone, hurt, and abandoned by a world that seemed to have no place for the vulnerable. Thomas had always said that you could judge a person's character by how they treated animals when no one was watching. Despite her own desperate circumstances, despite the extra burden it would create, Rebecca had torn strips from her petticoat to bind the colt's wound and fashioned a crude halter from rope she found near the abandoned wagon. If she was going to face whatever lay ahead, she wouldn't do it by abandoning another helpless creature to suffer. Now, as they approached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Rebecca wondered if her compassion had been misplaced foolishness. The colt's injury had slowed their progress considerably, and their meager food supplies had run out yesterday. Emma's fever seemed to be getting worse, and Rebecca herself felt lightheaded from dehydration and exhaustion. The few coins remaining in her purse wouldn't buy them a meal, let alone lodging. The town itself appeared as weary as its approaching visitors. Cedar Ridge had seen better days. That much was evident from the faded paint on the storefronts and the gaps where buildings had once stood. The Colorado silver boom had passed this place by, leaving behind the kind of community that survived on stubbornness and hope rather than prosperity. A handful of weathered buildings lined what generously might be called Main Street, their wooden sidewalks worn smooth by years of boots and weather. Rebecca paused at the edge of town, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of her situation. She was a widow with no money, no prospects, and no connections, carrying a sick child and leading a wounded animal into a place where she knew not a soul. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force, and for a moment she considered simply sitting down in the dust and surrendering to despair. Emma stirred in her arms, making a small sound of distress, and the moment of weakness passed. Rebecca Hayes had not survived Thomas's illness, the fire, and everything that followed by giving up when things seemed impossible. She adjusted her grip on her daughter, tugged gently on the Colt's makeshift lead, and continued into town. The few people on the street turned to stare, as the unlikely trio made their way past the general store and the saloon. An older woman sweeping her front porch paused in her work to watch them pass, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Two men loading supplies onto a wagon stopped their conversation to follow the stranger's progress with their eyes. Rebecca felt the weight of their attention but kept walking, unsure of her destination but determined to project more confidence than she felt. It was the sound of hammering that drew her attention to the far end of the street, where a man was working on what appeared to be repairs to a stable. Even from a distance she could see that he was tall and lean, his movements economical and purposeful. As they drew closer, she noticed the way he paused in his work to glance in their direction, his attention seeming to focus particularly on the limping colt. The stable itself was larger than she had expected, suggesting that this was once a more prosperous establishment. The wooden structure showed signs of recent repair, with new boards contrasting against the weathered original construction. A hand-painted sign hung slightly askew near the entrance. Hartwell Stables. Daniel Hartwell, proprietor. Daniel Hartwell appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered complexion that spoke of years spent outdoors. His dark hair was pushed back from his forehead, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms that showed the definition of a man accustomed to physical labor. When he looked up from his hammering as they approached, Rebecca was struck by the intensity of his gaze and the way his expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention as he took in the details of their situation. "Ma'am," he said, setting down his hammer and straightening to his full height. His voice carried the slight drawl of someone who had spent time in the Southern Territories. "Looks like you and yours have had a rough journey." Rebecca felt Emma shift against her shoulder and realized that her daughter was finally awake, though still listless with fever. The colt, perhaps sensing that they had stopped moving, lowered its head and stood with visible exhaustion. The animal's breathing was labored, and Rebecca could see that the makeshift bandage on its leg was now soaked through with blood. "We have," Rebecca admitted, her voice hoarse from dust and thirst. "I'm looking for someone who might know about," she faltered, realizing how foolish her quest suddenly sounded. "I'm looking for information about a family named Morrison. I was told they might live in this area." Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "Morrison," he repeated thoughtfully. "Can't say I know anyone by that name in Cedar Ridge. Been here about 2 years now, and I know most folks in town." He studied her face, perhaps reading the disappointment that she tried to hide. "Though there might be some families out on the ranches I haven't met yet." The hope that had sustained Rebecca through the long walk began to crumble. If Thomas's cousin wasn't here, if she had made this journey for nothing, then she and Emma were truly without options. The reality of their situation pressed in on her like the walls of a collapsing mine shaft. Daniel seemed to sense her distress because his expression softened. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you look like you could use some water and a place to sit down. Your little one there doesn't look too well either." It was then that his attention shifted fully to the colt, and Rebecca saw something change in his demeanor. The casual politeness was replaced by genuine concern as he took in the animal's condition. Without asking permission, he approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Easy there," he murmured, not to Rebecca, but to the colt. "Let's have a look at what happened to you." The horse shied slightly at his approach, but something in Daniel's voice or manner seemed to calm it. He knelt beside the animal, his hands gentle as he examined the wounded leg. Rebecca watched his face as he worked, noting the way his jaw tightened when he saw the extent of the injury. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of anger. "Someone did this deliberately." Rebecca nodded, her throat tight with emotion. 3 men on horseback. 2 days ago. They seemed to think it was entertaining. Daniel's hands stilled on the colt's leg, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Did they hurt you or your daughter?" "No," Rebecca said quickly. "We hid. But afterward, I couldn't just leave." She gestured helplessly at the colt. Something shifted in Daniel's expression then, a recognition of something he understood without need for explanation. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. "Animal like this, young as it is, injury this bad," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Most people would have put it down rather than drag it 30 miles in this heat." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca felt defensive heat rise in her cheeks. "I know it might seem foolish, but I couldn't abandon it to die alone." "Didn't say it was foolish," Daniel replied, his tone mild. "Said most people would have done it differently." He studied her face for a long moment. "Question is, what are you planning to do now? Horse needs proper medical attention, sooner rather than later. Your daughter looks like she's burning up with fever, and you look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." The blunt assessment of their situation, delivered without cruelty, but with unflinching honesty, nearly broke through Rebecca's carefully maintained composure. She had been trying so hard to project strength and competence that she had almost convinced herself that their circumstances weren't as desperate as they appeared. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I could find the Morrisons, they might help us until I could find work, earn enough to get back on our feet. But if they're not here..." Emma chose that moment to stir restlessly in her arms, making small sounds of distress that any mother would recognize as the prelude to serious crying. Rebecca bounced her gently, trying to soothe her, but the child's fever-bright eyes and flushed cheeks told their own story. Daniel watched this display with an unreadable expression. Then, without warning, he turned and walked toward the stable entrance. For a moment, Rebecca thought he was simply going back to his work, dismissing them as someone else's problem. But instead of picking up his hammer, he disappeared into the shadowy interior of the building. He emerged a few minutes later carrying a tin cup filled with water and what appeared to be a small cloth sack. He offered the cup to Rebecca first. "It's clean," he said simply. "Well water, pulled fresh this morning." Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully, drinking deeply before offering small sips to Emma. The child's lips were dry and cracked, and she drank eagerly despite her obvious discomfort. The cool water was the most wonderful thing Rebecca had tasted in days. While they drank, Daniel opened the cloth sack and pulled out several strips of clean linen and a small jar of what looked like salve. Without asking permission, he approached the Colt again, this time with supplies that suggested he knew something about treating wounded animals. "Used to work for a veterinarian back in Kansas," he explained, as he began removing Rebecca's makeshift bandage. "Before I came here and decided to try making a living with horses." The Colt flinched as Daniel cleaned the wound, but his touch was gentle and sure. Rebecca found herself watching his hands as he worked, noting the care he took not to cause unnecessary pain. There was something about his movements that suggested this wasn't the first time he had treated an injured animal, and certainly not the first time he had dealt with wounds inflicted by human cruelty. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Daniel said as he applied the salve. "Cuts deep enough to lame the animal, but not deep enough to sever anything vital. Wanted it to suffer, not die quick." The casual way he described such deliberate cruelty made Rebecca's stomach turn. "What kind of people do such things?" Daniel glanced up at her as he began wrapping the leg with clean bandages. "The kind that think power gives them the right to hurt whatever can't fight back." His voice was steady, but Rebecca caught the underlying anger. "The kind that would probably find it just as entertaining to torment a woman and child traveling alone." The implication hung in the air between them. Rebecca had been lucky that the men's attention had been focused on the horses that day. If they had discovered her hiding place, if Emma had cried out at the wrong moment, the outcome could have been very different. "There," Daniel said, securing the final wrap of bandage. "That should hold for now, but this animal needs rest and proper care if it's going to heal properly." He stood and looked directly at Rebecca. "Question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" The question felt like a test, though Rebecca wasn't sure what the right answer might be. "I'll do whatever I can," she said. "I brought the Colt this far. I won't abandon it now." Daniel nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied some internal criterion. Horse like this, young and healthy aside from the injury, could be worth training once it heals. Good bloodlines from the look of it. Wild horses in these parts often have Mustang and Thoroughbred mixed in from escaped ranch stock. Rebecca wasn't sure where this observation was leading, but she sensed it was important. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Daniel said carefully, that you might have more options than you think. But they would require you to stay in Cedar Ridge long enough to see them through. Emma stirred in Rebecca's arms, and she realized that her daughter's fever seemed to have broken slightly. The child's eyes were more alert, and she was taking an interest in her surroundings for the first time in hours. Her gaze fixed on the colt, and she made a small sound of interest. Horse, Emma said clearly, one of the few words in her limited vocabulary. Daniel's expression softened as he looked at the little girl. That's right, he said gently. That's a horse. A hurt horse that your mama helped. The simple interaction seemed to break through some invisible barrier. Daniel's demeanor shifted from cautious politeness to something approaching warmth. He looked at Rebecca with new interest. Your daughter has good instincts, he said. Not all children take to animals naturally, especially ones that are hurt or frightened. Her father always said she had a gift with animals, Rebecca replied, then felt the familiar pang of loss that accompanied any mention of Thomas. He said she understood them in a way that couldn't be taught. Daniel studied Emma's face as she continued to watch the colt with fascination. If that's true, she might be able to help with something I've been struggling with. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Daniel gestured toward the stable. Would you like to see the rest of the horses? Might be interesting to watch your daughter's reaction. Rebecca hesitated. Accepting Daniel's offer felt like stepping across some invisible threshold. Moving from polite interaction to something that might involve expectations or obligations she wasn't prepared to meet. But Emma's fever had clearly broken, and the prospect of getting out of the blazing sun was too attractive to refuse. All right, she said. But just for a few minutes. The interior of the stable was blissfully cool and filled with the familiar scents of hay, leather, and horses. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the boards, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced as dust motes drifted through the air. The building was larger than it had appeared from outside, with at least a dozen stalls lining both sides of a central aisle. Most of the stalls were occupied, and as they walked down the aisle, Rebecca found herself impressed by the quality of the animals Daniel kept. These weren't the broken-down nags she might have expected to find in a small-town stable. The horses were well-fed, well-groomed, and showed the kind of alertness that spoke of good care and handling. You have some beautiful animals, she said, meaning it. Thank you, Daniel replied. Most of them are horses I'm training for folks around the territory. Some are mine. Animals I've bought or traded for with the idea of developing their potential. Emma had grown more alert as they moved through the stable, her head turning to follow the movement of horses in their stalls. Several of the animals came to their stall doors as they passed, clearly accustomed to human interaction and hoping for attention or treats. It was near the back of the stable that Daniel stopped, his expression growing more serious. This is what I wanted to show you, he said, gesturing toward a stall that sat slightly apart from the others. The stall was larger than the rest, with higher walls and a gate that looked more substantial. Inside, Rebecca could see a horse unlike any of the others they had passed. It was a magnificent animal, clearly a thoroughbred, with a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany in the filtered sunlight. But as beautiful as the horse was, there was something in its demeanor that spoke of deep disturbance. The animal stood pressed against the far wall of the stall, its ears pinned back and its eyes showing white around the edges. Even from several feet away, Rebecca could sense the tension radiating from the horse like heat from a forge. This was an animal that had learned to fear human contact, and that fear had settled deep into its bones. His name is Thunder, Daniel said quietly. Belonged to a man who thought breaking a horse meant breaking its spirit. By the time I got him, he'd been beaten, starved, and handled so rough that he can't stand to have anyone come within 10 feet of him. Rebecca watched the horse carefully, noting the way it tracked their movement while maintaining maximum distance. How long have you had him? 6 months, Daniel replied. And in all that time, I've made almost no progress. He'll eat if I leave food and walk away, but any attempt to approach him directly sends him into a panic. I've tried everything I know, every technique I learned working with damaged animals, but nothing seems to get through to him. As if to demonstrate Daniel's point, Thunder shifted restlessly in his stall, his hooves striking the wooden floor in an agitated rhythm. The horse's breathing was rapid and shallow, the fight-or-flight response clearly triggered by their presence. But then something unexpected happened. Emma, who had been quietly observing from her mother's arms, made a soft sound, barely more than a whisper. It wasn't quite a word, more like a musical note hummed under her breath. The effect on Thunder was immediate and startling. The horse's ears pricked forward, and his agitated movement stilled. For a moment, horse and child regarded each other across the distance of the stall. "Well, I'll be damned," Daniel breathed. Emma made the sound again, a gentle, wordless vocalization that seemed to carry no threat or demand. Thunder took a step forward, still wary but clearly intrigued. His ears remained forward, and the wild look in his eyes had softened slightly. "She's never done anything like that before," Rebecca whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever spell was being woven. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the interaction between child and horse. "In 6 months, I've never seen him voluntarily move toward a human presence," he said quietly. "Not once." Emma reached out one small hand toward the horse, her movement slow and unthreatening. Thunder's nostrils flared as he tested the air, trying to understand this small being who seemed to represent no danger. The horse took another tentative step forward. "Mama," Emma said softly, the word barely audible, horse said. The simple observation, delivered in a child's matter-of-fact tone, carried more insight than months of adult analysis. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that her daughter had somehow recognized the depth of Thunder's emotional wounds. Daniel stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as he watched the careful dance between child and horse. Thunder had moved close enough to the stall door that, if he chose, he could extend his head over the barrier. For a moment, it seemed as though he might do exactly that. Then, as if suddenly remembering his fear, the horse shied back to the far wall, though his ears remained forward and his attention stayed fixed on Emma. "That was remarkable," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. "In all my years working with horses, I've never seen anything quite like that." Rebecca looked down at her daughter, seeing her with new eyes. Emma had always been unusually calm around animals, but this seemed to go beyond natural affinity into something approaching intuition. "Your husband was right," Daniel continued. "She does have a gift. Question is, would you be interested in letting her help me with Thunder?" The question hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Rebecca understood that Daniel was offering more than just a chance for Emma to interact with the horse. He was suggesting a reason for them to stay in Cedar Ridge, a purpose that might provide the foundation for building a new life. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rebecca asked carefully. Daniel leaned against the stall door, his expression thoughtful. "Thunder's owner paid me well to take him on, with a substantial bonus promised if I can get him fit for riding again. But at the rate I'm going, that could take years, if it's even possible." He gestured toward Emma. "Your daughter might be the key to reaching him, if she could help me make a breakthrough." "You're talking about a business arrangement," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I'm talking about a partnership," Daniel corrected. "You and Emma would need a place to stay, meals, medical care for your daughter when she needs it. I'd need your help with Thunder, and possibly with some of the other horses I'm training. The colt you brought in could recover here, and once it's healed, we could train it for sale or riding." Rebecca felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, but she forced herself to consider the practical aspects of what Daniel was suggesting. "I don't know anything about training horses, but you know about caring for things that are hurt and frightened," Daniel replied. "You proved that when you chose to help the colt, instead of leaving it behind. That kind of instinct can't be taught." Emma had grown restless in Rebecca's arms, and she set her daughter down carefully, keeping a firm grip on her hand. The little girl immediately began pulling toward Thunder's stall, her intention clear. "She wants to see the horse again," Rebecca observed. "And he wants to see her," Daniel replied. "Look." Thunder had indeed moved closer to the stall door again, drawn by Emma's presence despite his obvious fear. The horse's internal conflict was visible in every line of his body, the desire for connection warring with deeply ingrained terror. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Rebecca admitted quietly. "The Morrisons were my only lead, and if they're not here—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice the full extent of their desperate circumstances. Daniel's expression grew serious. "There's something else you should know before you make a decision," he said. "The men who hurt your colt, who attack the wild horses, they're not unknown in these parts. There's been trouble with a group calling themselves horse hunters, but they're really just thugs who enjoy causing pain. They've been working their way through the territory, and Cedar Ridge is right in their path." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stable's cool interior. "Are you saying they might come here?" "I'm saying it's possible," Daniel replied honestly. "And if they do, a woman and child staying alone at the boarding house or camping outside town would be vulnerable. But here, at the stable, with me." He let the implication hang unspoken. The offer of protection was clear, but Rebecca bristled slightly at the suggestion that she and Emma were helpless victims in need of rescue. "I've managed to keep us safe this far." "Yes, you have," Daniel agreed. "But you've also been lucky, and luck has a way of running out." Emma tugged on Rebecca's hand, trying to pull her closer to Thunder's stall. The horse watched their approach with obvious anxiety, but he didn't retreat to the back of the enclosure this time. Instead, he held his ground, ears forward, clearly torn between curiosity and fear. What would this arrangement involve exactly? Rebecca asked, trying to focus on practical details rather than the emotional appeal of Daniel's offer. "Room and board for you and Emma," Daniel said promptly. "There's a small cabin behind the stable that the previous owner used for storage. It needs some work, but it could be made comfortable. In exchange, you'd help with the day-to-day care of the horses, assist with training when appropriate, and let Emma work with Thunder when she's willing and able." Rebecca considered the proposal carefully. It offered them immediate shelter and security, but it also tied them to a man they barely knew in a place that might prove dangerous. Still, what were their alternatives? They had no money, no prospects, and winter was only a few months away. "And the colt?" she asked. "Would recover here and become part of the training program," Daniel replied. "Wild horses, once properly trained, often make excellent mounts. They have endurance and intelligence that you don't always find in domestic stock." Emma had grown tired of being restrained and began fussing to be let closer to Thunder's stall. Rebecca looked down at her daughter, then back at the magnificent, damaged horse who had shown more interest in a 3-year-old child than he had in months of expert handling. "I need to think about it," Rebecca said finally. Daniel nodded. "Of course. It's a big decision." He paused, then added, "But while you're thinking, you and Emma are welcome to stay in the main house tonight. There's a spare room, and your daughter looks like she could use a proper meal and a safe place to sleep." The offer of immediate shelter was too tempting to refuse, especially with Emma's fever only recently broken and the sun beginning to set outside. Rebecca felt her careful defenses crumbling in the face of such unexpected kindness. "That's very generous," she said, "but I should warn you, Emma sometimes has nightmares. She's been through a lot these past few months, and she doesn't always sleep well in unfamiliar places." "Understood," Daniel said simply. "We'll manage." As they prepared to leave the stable, Thunder moved to the front of his stall again, clearly reluctant to see Emma go. The horse's behavior was so different from what Daniel had described that Rebecca found herself wondering what other changes might be possible if they stayed. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The wounded colt had found a patch of grass near the stable and was grazing carefully, favoring its injured leg but showing more alertness than it had since Rebecca first found it. The sight of the animal beginning to recover gave her a small surge of hope. Daniel's house proved to be a modest but comfortable structure adjacent to the stable, with the kind of practical layout that spoke of a man who valued function over form. The spare room he showed them was clean and simply furnished, with a window that looked out over the corral, where several horses stood quietly in the gathering dusk. "I'll get some supper started," Daniel said. "Nothing fancy, but it should be filling." Rebecca accepted gratefully, realizing that it had been nearly 2 days since any of them had eaten a proper meal. As Daniel busied himself in the kitchen, she took the opportunity to wash some of the dust and grime from the journey off herself and Emma. The simple act of cleaning her daughter's face and hands, of seeing Emma's natural coloring return as the fever flush faded, made Rebecca feel more optimistic than she had in weeks. Supper was indeed simple but substantial. Beef stew with vegetables from Daniel's garden, fresh bread, and milk that was clearly from local cows. Emma ate with an appetite that told Rebecca her daughter was truly on the road to recovery, and she found herself relaxing for the first time since they had left Denver. "Tell me about the previous owner of this place," Rebecca said as they finished eating. "You mentioned he used the cabin for storage." Daniel's expression grew somber. "Man named Fletcher. Ran the stable for about 10 years before he decided to move on to California. Good horseman, but he had some gambling debts that caught up with him. Sold the place to me for less than it was worth because he needed to leave town quickly." "And you came here from Kansas?" "By way of several other places," Daniel replied. "I've never been one to put down roots easily, but this place, this work, it feels right somehow." Rebecca sensed there was more to Daniel's story than he was sharing, but she didn't press. Everyone had reasons for the choices they made, and she was hardly in a position to judge someone else's past. After supper, as Emma played quietly on the floor with a carved wooden horse that Daniel had produced from somewhere, Rebecca found herself drawn to the window that looked out over the stable yard. The wounded colt was visible in the moonlight, standing near the water trough and looking more alert than it had since she'd found it. "You're having second thoughts," Daniel observed, joining her at the window. "I'm having all kinds of thoughts," Rebecca admitted. "This is a big decision, and I need to be sure I'm making it for the right reasons." "What would the right reasons be?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "A chance to build something stable for Emma. Work that uses skills I actually have. The opportunity to help heal something that's been broken." "Those sound like pretty good reasons to me," Daniel said quietly. "But there are wrong reasons too," Rebecca continued. "Fear of being alone, gratitude for kindness that might cloud my judgment, the comfort of having someone else make the difficult decisions." Daniel was silent for a moment, watching the horses in the corral. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "When you found that colt, injured and abandoned, what made you decide to help it instead of just walking on?" Rebecca thought back to that moment 2 days ago, trying to recapture the emotions that had driven her decision. "I couldn't stand the thought of leaving it to die alone," she said simply. "It seemed wrong to add to the cruelty that had already been done. Even though helping it made your own situation more difficult." "Even though?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That tells me something about who you are, Rebecca Hayes. It tells me that you make decisions based on what's right, not what's easy. That's the kind of person I'd like to have as a partner in this work." Before Rebecca could respond, Emma toddled over to the window, pressing her small hands against the glass as she looked out at the horses. "Mama," she said clearly, "horses sleeping?" "Some of them are," Rebecca replied, lifting her daughter so she could see better. "They're safe and comfortable, so they can rest." Emma studied the scene outside with the intensity that only small children could bring to simple observations. "Horse happy?" she asked. The question was directed at the view outside, but Rebecca felt it was about more than just the animals in the corral. Emma was asking about safety, about the possibility of happiness after fear and pain. She was asking, in her simple way, whether this place could truly offer them what they needed. Looking out at the peaceful scene, at the colt that was already showing signs of recovery, at the stable where Thunder waited with his careful hope for healing, Rebecca felt something settle in her chest. For the first time since Thomas's death, she could envision a future that involved more than mere survival. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I think the horses are happy here." Dawn came early to Cedar Ridge, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Rebecca woke to the sound of Emma's soft breathing beside her and the distant nickering of horses from the stable. For a moment she lay still, allowing herself to savor the unfamiliar sensation of waking up somewhere safe and warm. The bed was comfortable, the room clean, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the immediate press of crisis demanding her attention. Emma stirred beside her, her small body warm against Rebecca's side. The fever that had worried Rebecca so much yesterday seemed to have broken completely during the night, and her daughter's breathing was clear and steady. As if sensing her mother's attention, Emma's eyes fluttered open, bright and alert in a way they hadn't been for days. "Mama," Emma said clearly, her voice stronger than it had been since before their journey began. "Horses?" Rebecca smiled, stroking her daughter's soft hair. "Yes, sweetheart. The horses are just outside. Would you like to see them after we get dressed?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, already trying to scramble out of bed with the boundless energy that only healthy 3-year-olds possessed. The transformation from the listless, feverish child of yesterday was remarkable, and Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Daniel for providing the shelter and care that had made Emma's recovery possible. As they dressed in the early morning light, Rebecca found herself listening to the sounds of activity from outside. She could hear Daniel's voice speaking quietly to the horses, the sound of gates opening and closing, the rustle of hay being distributed. It was a peaceful symphony of morning routine that spoke of established patterns and careful attention to the animals in his care. When they emerged from the house, they found Daniel already at work in the corral, leading a magnificent black gelding through what appeared to be a training exercise. The horse moved with fluid grace, responding to subtle cues from Daniel's body language and voice. It was clear that this was a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding rather than domination. Emma tugged on Rebecca's hand, pulling her toward the fence where they could watch more closely. Daniel noticed their approach and raised a hand in greeting, though he didn't interrupt his work with the horse. Rebecca appreciated his professionalism, understanding that training required complete attention and consistency. "That's Midnight," Daniel called out during a brief pause in the exercise. "He belongs to the banker in town. Man bought him because he looked impressive, but never took the time to build a proper relationship with him. Now he wants me to make the horse suitable for his teenage son to ride." Rebecca watched as Daniel continued working with Midnight, noting the patience he showed as the horse occasionally balked or showed confusion. There was no harsh correction, no punishment for mistakes, just calm redirection and positive reinforcement when the horse responded correctly. "How long does it usually take?" she asked when Daniel brought Midnight to a halt near the fence. "Depends on the horse and what they've learned before," Daniel replied, patting Midnight's neck affectionately. "This fellow has good instincts, but he's been handled inconsistently, sometimes rewarded for behavior, sometimes punished for the same thing. That creates confusion and anxiety." Emma reached through the fence rails, her small hand extended toward Midnight. The horse, curious about this tiny human, stretched his neck to investigate. His nostrils flared as he caught Emma's scent, and then, to Rebecca's amazement, he gently nuzzled her palm with his soft muzzle. "Well, that's interesting," Daniel observed. "Midnight is usually quite shy with strangers, especially children. He was mistreated by some youngsters before his current owner bought him." "Emma has always had a way with animals," Rebecca said, watching her daughter's delighted expression as Midnight continued to show interest in her. "But yesterday, with Thunder, that was something I'd never seen before." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "Speaking of Thunder, I was hoping you might be willing to try another visit with him this morning. After yesterday's reaction, I'm curious to see if he'll show the same interest." Rebecca felt a flutter of nervousness at the suggestion. Yesterday's interaction had been spontaneous, unplanned. Deliberately seeking to recreate that magic felt different, more loaded with expectations and potential disappointment. What if it doesn't work the same way, she asked. What if Emma's presence agitates him instead of calming him? Then we'll know that yesterday was a unique moment, Daniel replied practically. But if we don't try, we'll never know if it could be the beginning of a breakthrough. Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road leading into town. 3 riders were coming toward the stable at a steady pace, and even from a distance, there was something about their approach that put Rebecca on edge. The riders sat their horses with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, and their clothing and equipment suggested they were well-funded despite their rough appearance. Daniel's entire demeanor changed as he recognized the approaching men. His body tensed, and his hand moved instinctively to rest on the handle of the knife at his belt. Midnight, sensing the change in his handler's mood, shifted nervously and tossed his head. "Take Emma into the stable," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying an urgency that made Rebecca's heart race. "Keep her away from the windows and don't come out until I call for you." "Who are they?" Rebecca whispered, but she was already moving, scooping Emma into her arms despite her daughter's protests. "Trouble," Daniel replied grimly. "The kind we hoped wouldn't find us so soon." Rebecca hurried Emma into the stable, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. The men approaching weren't customers looking for horse training services. They were something else entirely, and Daniel's reaction suggested they represented genuine danger. Inside the stable, the horses sensed the tension in the air. Several of them moved restlessly in their stalls, ears pricked forward as they detected the approach of unfamiliar riders. Thunder, in his isolated stall at the back, was particularly agitated, pacing in tight circles and breathing heavily. Emma, picking up on her mother's anxiety, began to whimper. "Mama's scared?" she asked, her small arms tightening around Rebecca's neck. "Mama's just being careful," Rebecca replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're going to stay quiet and wait for Mr. Daniel to tell us it's safe to come out." Through a gap in the stable boards, Rebecca could see the three riders pull up in front of the building. The leader was a big man with graying hair and cold eyes, his clothing expensive but practical. The other two were younger, with the kind of hard faces that suggested they were accustomed to violence. "Hartwell," the leader called out, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "Heard you might have something that belongs to us." Daniel emerged from the corral, leading Midnight but keeping the horse between himself and the visitors. "Don't know what you mean, Crenshaw," he replied evenly. "Everything here belongs to either me or my clients." Crenshaw dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and threatening. "That's so? Because word is you've got yourself a young colt with a particular injury. Colt, that went missing from our herd a few days back." Rebecca's blood ran cold as she realized they were talking about the wounded animal she had rescued. These were the men who had attacked the wild horses, who had deliberately injured the colt for their own amusement. They had somehow tracked it here, and now they were claiming ownership. "I've got several young horses here," Daniel said carefully. "None of them came from your herd, legal or otherwise." "Legal?" Crenshaw laughed, the sound harsh and unpleasant. "That's a good one, Hartwell. You always were particular about legal niceties, but out here, possession tends to matter more than paperwork." One of the younger men had dismounted as well and was moving toward the stable entrance. Rebecca pulled Emma deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding as she tried to think of a way to protect her daughter if the situation escalated. "Stay where you are, Pike," Daniel commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Pike paused, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Property rights are a funny thing, aren't they? Depend a lot on who's enforcing them." He glanced meaningfully at his companions. "Seems to me we've got more enforcement power than you do at the moment." Through the gap in the boards, Rebecca could see Daniel's jaw tighten. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he showed no sign of backing down. There was something in his posture that reminded her of Thunder, the same careful balance between fear and defiance. "The colt you're looking for isn't here," Daniel said firmly. "And even if it was, you'd need to prove ownership before I'd turn over any animal." Crenshaw's expression darkened. "Proof?" He gestured toward the stable. "How about I just take a look around and see what I can find? Might save us all some time and unpleasantness." "How about you don't?" Daniel replied. "Like I said, this is private property. You want to search it? You'll need to come back with the sheriff and a warrant." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Rebecca could see that the confrontation was escalating beyond mere words, and she found herself desperately wishing for some way to help Daniel without exposing Emma to danger. It was at that moment that Thunder's agitation reached a crescendo. The traumatized horse had been growing increasingly distressed as the hostile voices grew louder, and now his fear manifested in a series of thunderous kicks against his stall door. The sound echoed through the stable like gunshots, causing several of the other horses to whinny and shift nervously. "What the hell was that?" Pike demanded, his hand moving to his weapon. "Nervous horse," Daniel replied calmly, though Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders. "Doesn't like strangers." Crenshaw's eyes narrowed with interest. Nervous horse or guilty conscience? Maybe we should have that look around after all. Before Daniel could respond, Pike was striding toward the stable entrance, his intentions clear. Rebecca pressed herself and Emma deeper into the shadows, praying they wouldn't be discovered. But as Pike's silhouette appeared in the doorway, blocking much of the morning light, she realized they were trapped. The man's eyes scanned the interior of the stable, taking inventory of the horses and equipment. When his gaze reached the area where Rebecca and Emma were hiding, she held her breath, hoping the shadows would conceal them. But Emma, frightened by the strange man's presence and confused by her mother's obvious fear, chose that moment to make a small sound of distress. It was barely more than a whimper, but in the tense silence of the stable it might as well have been a shout. Pike's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate its source. "Well, well," he said slowly. "Looks like you've got more than horses hiding in here, Hartwell." Rebecca's heart sank as Pike moved toward their hiding place. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to conceal Emma further. All she could do was hold her daughter close and hope that these men retained some shred of humanity when it came to children. "Come on out," Pike called, his voice falsely friendly. "No point hiding now that we know you're there." Reluctantly, Rebecca emerged from the shadows, Emma clutched protectively in her arms. Pike's eyes widened with surprise and something else, something that made Rebecca's skin crawl with its implications. "Boys," Pike called to his companions, "you need to see this." Crenshaw and the third man entered the stable, their expressions shifting from mild interest to predatory focus as they took in the sight of Rebecca and Emma. The leader's gaze lingered on Rebecca's face and figure in a way that made her wish she could disappear entirely. "Now, this is interesting," Crenshaw said slowly. "Daniel Hartwell, the man who claims to keep such a moral operation, hiding a woman and child in his stable, makes a man wonder what other secrets you might be keeping." "They're guests," Daniel said firmly, moving to position himself between the men and Rebecca. "And they're under my protection." "Protection," Crenshaw repeated, tasting the word. "From what, I wonder? Or maybe the question is, protection in exchange for what?" The implication in his tone made Rebecca feel sick. These men were assuming the worst possible interpretation of her presence here, and she could see Daniel's anger building in response to their crude suggestions. "You've said your piece about the Colt," Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "It's time for you to leave." "Oh, but we haven't finished our conversation," Crenshaw replied. "See, now I'm curious about your guests. Woman traveling alone with a child, hiding in stables, no sign of a husband or male relative. That raises all sorts of interesting questions." Emma had grown increasingly distressed during this exchange, and now she began to cry in earnest. The sound seemed to echo through the stable, adding to the already heightened tension. Thunder's agitation increased in response to Emma's distress, and his kicking became more violent. "Please," Rebecca said, finding her voice despite her fear. "You're frightening my daughter. Whatever business you have here doesn't involve us." "Doesn't it?" Crenshaw stepped closer, ignoring Daniel's warning growl. "See, I'm thinking a woman in your position might be very motivated to cooperate with reasonable men like ourselves, especially if those men were in a position to offer protection and opportunities." The threat was barely veiled, and Rebecca felt her legs grow weak with fear. These weren't just men looking for a stolen horse. They were predators who had recognized vulnerability and were moving to exploit it. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "You've got 5 seconds to get off my property before I start shooting." Pike laughed. "Big talk for a man who's outnumbered 3-1. "Maybe," Daniel replied. "But the first bullet's got your name on it, Pike. Want to find out if I'm fast enough to make it count?" The standoff stretched taut as a wire, each man calculating odds and consequences. Rebecca could see that Daniel was serious about his threat, but she also knew that 3 armed men against 1 would likely end in disaster, no matter how skilled Daniel might be. It was Thunder who broke the stalemate. The traumatized horse, pushed beyond his breaking point by the combination of hostile voices and Emma's crying, finally succeeded in kicking open his stall door. The heavy wooden barrier splintered with a crack like thunder, and suddenly 1,200 pounds of terrified, angry horseflesh was loose in the stable. Thunder exploded from his stall like a force of nature, his eyes rolled back white with panic and rage. The horse had been driven beyond rational thought by months of abuse and the current confrontation, and now he was a living weapon seeking any target for his fear and fury. Pike, who had been standing closest to Thunder's stall, found himself directly in the path of the maddened animal. He had barely enough time to register the danger before Thunder was upon him, rearing up on his hind legs with his front hooves flashing like hammers. The man threw himself sideways, barely avoiding the crushing blow of Thunder's hooves. The horse landed heavily and immediately wheeled to face this new threat, his ears pinned back and his nostrils flaring. Pike scrambled backward on hands and knees, his earlier bravado completely forgotten in the face of mortal danger. "Jesus Christ!" Crenshaw shouted, drawing his gun. "Shoot the damn thing!" "No!" Daniel's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Nobody shoots in my stable!" Thunder, hearing the shouting, spun toward Crenshaw with deadly intent. The horse's trauma had taught him to associate raised voices and sudden movements with pain and cruelty, and now those instincts were driving him to attack first and think later. But as Thunder charged toward Crenshaw, something extraordinary happened. Emma, still in her mother's arms but no longer crying, made that same soft, musical sound she had produced the day before. It was barely audible over the chaos, but Thunder heard it. The effect was instantaneous and miraculous. Thunder's charge faltered, his ears pricking forward as he searched for the source of that gentle sound. His wild eyes found Emma, and for a moment the madness seemed to drain out of them. "Horse sad," Emma said clearly, her small voice carrying perfectly in the sudden silence. "Horse scared." Thunder stopped completely, his sides heaving with exertion and emotion. The rage was still there, but it was now tempered by confusion and a desperate need to understand this small being who seemed to see his pain so clearly. Crenshaw and his men were frozen in shock, unsure whether to run, fight, or simply try to avoid drawing the horse's attention. Pike was still on the ground, his face pale with terror as he realized how close he had come to being trampled. Daniel, recognizing the fragile nature of the moment, began to move slowly toward Thunder. His voice was soft and steady as he spoke, a counterpoint to Emma's continued gentle sounds. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you. The bad men are leaving now." Whether Thunder understood the words or simply responded to the tone, the horse allowed Daniel to approach. His body was still tense with potential violence, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. "Get out," Daniel said to Crenshaw, his voice still soft but carrying absolute authority. "Now," before he changes his mind. Crenshaw looked from the horse to Daniel to Rebecca and Emma, his expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "This isn't over, Hartwell," he said finally. "We'll be back, and next time we'll bring the law with us." "You do that," Daniel replied. "I'm sure Sheriff Morrison would be very interested to hear about your business practices." The name Morrison hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Sheriff Morrison, not just Morrison. The family she had been looking for, Thomas's distant cousin, was here in Cedar Ridge after all. The irony was almost overwhelming. Crenshaw noticed her reaction and filed it away for future use. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Very interesting indeed." The three men retreated from the stable, Pike limping slightly from his encounter with Thunder's hooves. They mounted their horses with less swagger than they had shown upon arrival, but their parting looks promised that this confrontation was far from over. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the distance, Daniel turned his attention back to Thunder. The horse was still agitated, but no longer actively dangerous. Emma's continued soft vocalization seemed to be having a calming effect, and gradually Thunder's breathing began to slow. "That was incredible," Daniel said softly, his eyes moving between Emma and the horse. "I've never seen anything like it." Rebecca was shaking with delayed reaction to the confrontation, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate situation. "Is Thunder all right?" He seemed so frightened. "He was," Daniel confirmed. "Men like Crenshaw represent everything he's learned to fear. But Emma..." He shook his head in wonder. She reached him when nothing else could. Emma, oblivious to the drama surrounding her actions, reached out toward Thunder with one small hand. "Horse better?" she asked hopefully. Thunder, drawn by her voice and manner, took a tentative step forward. It was a gesture of trust so profound that both adults held their breath. afraid to break the spell. The horse stretched his neck toward Emma, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. For a moment, girl and horse regarded each other across the small distance that separated them. Then, with infinite gentleness, Thunder brushed his muzzle against Emma's outstretched palm. The touch lasted only seconds before Thunder shied back, his old fears reasserting themselves. But the connection had been made, the first real breakthrough in months of patient work. Daniel's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he witnessed this small miracle. "Sheriff Morrison," Rebecca said suddenly, remembering Crenshaw's reaction to the name. "Daniel, is the sheriff really named Morrison?" Daniel nodded, his attention still focused on Thunder as he began the delicate process of coaxing the horse back into a stall. "Ben Morrison. Good man. Honest lawman. Why do you ask?" "Morrison was the name I was looking for," Rebecca explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Thomas Morrison was my husband's cousin. I came to Cedar Ridge hoping to find him." Daniel's hand stilled on Thunder's halter as the implications sank in. "Ben Morrison's father was named Thomas, died about 5 years ago of a heart attack. Ben took over as sheriff after that." Rebecca felt the last piece of her husband's legacy click into place. Thomas Morrison, the distant cousin her husband had mentioned in passing, had been the sheriff's father. The family connection she had been seeking was still here, just one generation removed from what she had expected. "I need to speak with him," Rebecca said. "Sheriff Morrison. If he's family, even distantly, he has a right to know about Thomas's death. And about Emma." Daniel nodded slowly. "That might be wise, especially after what just happened here. Ben needs to know about Crenshaw and his men, about their threats and their claims on that Colt." As if summoned by their conversation, the wounded Colt appeared at the stable entrance. The young horse had apparently been grazing nearby during the confrontation and was now seeking the safety of the barn. Its injury was healing well under Daniel's care, but it still moved carefully, favoring the wounded leg. "There's our fugitive," Daniel said with grim humor. "The horse that started all this trouble." Rebecca looked at the colt, remembering the moment 2 days ago when she had first seen it standing injured and abandoned. Her decision to help the animal had led to this confrontation, had brought danger to Daniel's peaceful stable, but it had also brought them to Cedar Ridge, to the possibility of family and belonging that she had thought was lost forever. "Do you regret it?" she asked Daniel. "Taking us in, getting involved in our troubles?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the colt to Thunder, who was now standing quietly in a temporary stall, to Emma, who was watching the horses with fascination. "Ask me that question again in a few months," he said finally, "when we see how all this plays out." The rest of the morning was spent in careful restoration of normal routine. Daniel worked with Thunder, testing the boundaries of the breakthrough Emma had achieved. The horse was still wary and easily startled, but there was a new quality to his attention, a willingness to consider human presence that hadn't existed before. Emma, for her part, seemed completely unaware that she had done anything remarkable. She played quietly, while her mother helped Daniel with routine stable chores, occasionally making her soft sounds when Thunder appeared agitated. Each time, the horse's ears would prick forward and his breathing would steady. "It's like she's speaking his language," Daniel observed as they watched Emma calm Thunder during a particularly difficult moment. "But I don't understand how she knows what to say." "Neither do I," Rebecca admitted. "But Thomas always said that understanding comes from the heart, not the head. Maybe Emma's heart is just more open than most." By midday, Daniel felt confident enough to leave Thunder in the temporary stall, while they made a trip into town to speak with Sheriff Morrison. The colt, now moving more easily, was turned out into a small paddock where it could graze and move freely while remaining secure. The ride into Cedar Ridge gave Rebecca her first good look at the town in daylight. It was larger than she had realized the previous evening, with a main street that showed signs of recent growth and prosperity. New buildings stood alongside older structures, and the general atmosphere was one of a community that was working to build something lasting. Sheriff Morrison's office was located in a sturdy brick building that also housed the town's small jail. Ben Morrison himself proved to be a man in his early 40s, with the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence. His resemblance to Rebecca's late husband was subtle but unmistakable, mainly in the shape of his eyes and the way he carried himself. "Mrs. Hayes," he said after Daniel had made the introductions. "Daniel tells me you might be family." Rebecca explained about her marriage to Thomas Morrison, about her husband's death and her journey west with Emma. Ben listened carefully, asking gentle questions that helped establish the family connection without making her feel interrogated. "I remember my father mentioning a cousin named Thomas who had moved back east," Ben said finally. "Said he'd married a fine woman and was doing well in business." "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hayes. Sorry that it took such difficult circumstances to bring us together." The acceptance and warmth in his voice nearly broke Rebecca's careful composure. After months of feeling completely alone in the world, she was being welcomed as family by a man she had never met. "There's something else you need to know," Daniel said, and he proceeded to tell Ben about Crenshaw's visit and the threats that had been made. Ben's expression grew serious as he listened to the account of the morning's confrontation. "Jake Crenshaw's been trouble for months," he said when Daniel finished. "Claims to be in the horse trading business, but we've had reports of theft, intimidation, and worse from several counties. Problem is, he's careful to stay just on the legal side of things, and victims are often too scared to press charges." "What about the Colt?" Rebecca asked. "He claims it belongs to him." "Does he have any proof of ownership?" Ben asked. "Bill of sale, brand, anything like that?" "Nothing that I saw," Daniel replied. "Just his word that it came from his herd." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Then legally, possession belongs to whoever can prove they've been caring for the animal. Since you found it injured and provided medical care, you've got a stronger claim than Crenshaw does." Rebecca felt a surge of relief at this news. The Colt's legal status had been one of her primary worries about staying in Cedar Ridge. "But that won't stop Crenshaw from making trouble," Ben continued. "He's not the type to accept legal defeat gracefully. You folks need to be careful, especially you, Mrs. Hayes. Men like Crenshaw see a woman alone with a child as an easy target." "She's not alone," Daniel said firmly. "She's under my protection, and she's got family in town now." Ben smiled at the quiet declaration. "That she does, and I take care of my family, blood or otherwise." The sheriff's support was another weight lifted from Rebecca's shoulders. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly safe, protected not just by Daniel's individual strength, but by community and family connections. "There's one more thing," Ben said as they prepared to leave. "I'd like you to consider pressing charges against Crenshaw for trespassing and making threats. It won't stop him permanently, but it might make him think twice about targeting you specifically." Rebecca looked at Daniel, seeking his opinion. The idea of deliberately antagonizing Crenshaw was frightening, but she understood the sheriff's logic. Men like Crenshaw respected strength and consequences. "I'll do whatever you think is best," she said finally. "I won't let fear control my decisions anymore." Ben nodded approvingly. "That's the Morrison spirit. We'll get the paperwork started this afternoon." The ride back to the stable was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the morning's events and their implications. Emma had fallen asleep in Rebecca's arms, exhausted by the day's excitement and drama. "You know this changes everything," Daniel said as they approached the stable. "Once you file those charges, there's no going back to anonymity. Crenshaw will know exactly who you are and where to find you." "I know," Rebecca replied, "but hiding hasn't kept us safe so far. Maybe it's time to stand and fight." Daniel's smile was full of admiration and something deeper that made Rebecca's heart skip. "Thomas Morrison must have been quite a man to win a woman like you." "He was," Rebecca said softly, "but he's gone, and Emma and I have to build our future on our own choices, not just his memory." As they entered the stable yard, they found Thunder standing at the fence of his paddock, his ears pricked forward as he watched for their return. The change in the horse's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The rigid tension that had characterized his posture for months had relaxed slightly, and there was a new quality of alertness in his eyes. "He's been watching for us," Daniel observed with wonder. Or, more specifically, watching for Emma. As if to confirm Daniel's observation, Thunder nickered softly when he spotted Emma in her mother's arms. The sound was barely audible, but it represented a profound breakthrough for a horse that had refused to acknowledge human presence for months. Emma stirred at the sound, opening her eyes and immediately focusing on Thunder. "Horse, say hello," she announced with 3-year-old certainty. "Yes, sweetheart," Rebecca agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "The horse is saying hello." As they settled into the afternoon routine of stable work, Rebecca found herself thinking about the events of the day and their implications for the future. The confrontation with Crenshaw had been frightening, but it had also revealed the strength of the support system that was forming around her and Emma. Daniel's protection, Sheriff Morrison's family connection, and even Thunder's growing trust all represented threads in a web of belonging that she had thought was lost forever. The wounded colt, grazing peacefully in its paddock, had become a symbol of something larger than just animal rescue. Like Thunder, like herself and Emma, it represented the possibility of healing after trauma, of building new strength from broken pieces. As the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a future that involved more than mere survival. For the first time since Thomas's death, she could envision happiness, purpose, and the kind of home that was built not just on shelter but on love, trust, and mutual support. Thunder stood at his fence, watching Emma with patient attention as she played in the stable yard. The horse's eyes held a new light, a spark of hope that had been absent for so long that its return seemed miraculous. And in that moment, Rebecca understood that healing was possible for all of them, that broken hearts and damaged spirits could find their way back to wholeness with time, patience, and the gentle touch of love. The battle with Crenshaw was far from over, but Rebecca no longer faced it alone. She had found family, partnership, and purpose in the most unlikely of places. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the strength that came from knowing she belonged somewhere, that she and Emma were valued and protected by people who had chosen to care about their well-being. As darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, the stable settled into peaceful quiet. Thunder dozed standing up, one ear cocked toward the house where Emma slept safely. The wounded colt rested in its paddock, its healing body growing stronger each day. And in the modest house beside the stable, Rebecca lay awake planning for a future that finally held the promise of joy alongside its inevitable challenges. Tomorrow would bring new tests of the fragile trust they were all building, but tonight, for the first time in months, Rebecca slept without fear, surrounded by the quiet sounds of horses and the knowledge that she had found her way home. 3 weeks after filing charges against Crenshaw, Rebecca woke to an unusual stillness that set her nerves on edge. The morning air carried a tension that seemed to make even the horses restless, and Thunder paced his paddock with renewed anxiety despite the progress he had made with Emma's gentle influence. Daniel emerged from the barn with a grim expression, his rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. "Riders coming," he said simply. "More than we've seen before." Through the early morning mist, Rebecca could make out at least 6 horsemen approaching at a deliberate pace. Crenshaw had returned as promised, but this time he had brought reinforcements. The legal charges had apparently pushed him beyond mere intimidation into open confrontation. "Get Emma to the root cellar behind the house," Daniel instructed. "Whatever happens, keep her quiet and don't come out until Sheriff Morrison arrives." "How do you know he's coming?" "Sent word yesterday when I spotted Crenshaw's men scouting the area. Ben said he'd be here at first light with deputies." Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched the approaching riders. "Question is whether they'll arrive in time." Rebecca gathered Emma quickly, but as they moved toward the house, her daughter pulled back toward Thunder's paddock. The horse stood at the fence, his ears flattened, and his body trembling with the effort to contain his terror at the approaching threat. "Horse scared again," Emma said with heartbreaking clarity. "I know, sweetheart, but we have to go where it's safe." Emma shook her head stubbornly. "Help, horse. Make better." Before Rebecca could stop her, Emma broke free and ran toward Thunder's paddock. The traumatized animal, seeing the child approach while his world filled with the sounds of hostile voices and thundering hooves, faced an impossible choice between his learned fear and his growing trust. Thunder chose trust. As Crenshaw and his men rode into the yard, they found not the easy targets they expected, but a scene that gave them pause. A 3-year-old girl stood beside a horse that every man in the territory knew was untouchable, her small hand resting on his neck as she whispered calming sounds that seemed to steady both their nerves. "Well," Crenshaw said, dismounting slowly, "isn't this touching?" Daniel stepped forward, his rifle held ready but not quite threatening. "You're trespassing, Crenshaw." Sheriff's been notified. Sheriff's been delayed. One of Crenshaw's men called out with ugly satisfaction. Bridge washed out in the storm last night. Won't be crossing Miller's Creek for hours yet. Rebecca felt her heart sink. They were alone against 6 armed men with no help coming, but as she watched Emma continue to calm Thunder despite the growing tension, she felt a strange sense of resolve settle over her. "What do you want?" she called out, stepping into view despite Daniel's sharp gesture for her to stay hidden. Crenshaw's smile was cold as winter wind. "Simple transaction, Mrs. Hayes. My horse for your safety. You hand over that colt you stole, drop the charges, and I'll consider our business concluded. And if we refuse, then things get unpleasant for everyone, especially for folks who don't know when to mind their own business." Thunder snorted and shifted, picking up on the hostility in Crenshaw's voice. But Emma's continued presence kept him from bolting. And something in the horse's stance had changed. He was no longer cowering, but standing protective, placing himself between Emma and the perceived threat. "The colt stays," Daniel said firmly, "along with everyone else under my protection." Crenshaw nodded to his men, who began spreading out to surround the stable yard. "Your choice, Hartwell, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. This doesn't have to end badly if you're smart about it." It was then that the wounded colt, now nearly healed and grazing in the far paddock, caught sight of Crenshaw. The young horse's reaction was immediate and violent. With a scream of rage that echoed across the valley, the colt charged toward the fence, separating it from its tormentors. The sound shattered the morning stillness and triggered chaos. Thunder, already on edge, reared in response to the colt's cry. Several of Crenshaw's horses shied and pranced, their riders fighting to maintain control. In the confusion, Daniel saw his opportunity. "Now, Rebecca, get Emma out of here!" But Emma refused to leave Thunder, and Thunder refused to abandon Emma. The horse had found something worth protecting for the first time in his broken life, and no amount of fear would make him run. The standoff stretched taut as wire until the sound of galloping hooves announced new arrivals. Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies crested the hill at full speed, having found an alternate route when the main bridge proved impassable. "That's far enough, Crenshaw." Morrison's voice carried the full authority of his badge. "You and your men are under arrest for trespassing and making terroristic threats." Crenshaw's face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Hartwell. That woman and her brat won't always have protection." "Yes, they will," Daniel said quietly, his words carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "Because I'm asking Rebecca Hayes to marry me, and Emma to be my daughter. They'll have the protection of my name and everything I own for as long as I draw breath." The proposal, delivered in the midst of armed confrontation, stunned everyone present into momentary silence. Rebecca stared at Daniel in amazement while Emma clapped her hands with delight. "Yes," Emma announced before her mother could speak. "Daniel be papa!" Thunder, as if understanding the significance of the moment, nuzzled Emma gently and nickered his approval. The wounded colt, still agitated, but no longer charging, paced its paddock and called out in what sounded remarkably like agreement. Crenshaw's face darkened with fury, but with 3 lawmen present and his intimidation tactics clearly failing, he had no choice but to mount his horse and retreat with his men. "This isn't finished," he snarled as they rode away. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Morrison called after them. "You're banned from this county, Crenshaw. Show your face here again, and you'll be arrested on sight." As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Daniel approached Rebecca and Emma at Thunder's paddock. The horse, instead of shying away from additional human presence, remained calm and watchful. "I meant what I said," Daniel told Rebecca quietly. It wasn't just for show. Rebecca looked at this man who had offered them shelter, protection, and now his name. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, wounded and desperate, and how they had all found healing together. "Horse happy now," Emma announced, patting Thunder's neck. "All family happy." Thunder, as if in agreement, lowered his great head and gently nuzzled the child who had saved his spirit. The wounded colt called out from its paddock, and Thunder answered with a soft whinny that carried no trace of his former fear. "Yes," Rebecca said, her voice strong and certain. "We accept, both of us." As Sheriff Morrison completed the paperwork to officially transfer ownership of the colt to their family, and Daniel began planning improvements to the stable that would accommodate their growing operation, Rebecca realized that sometimes the most broken things could become the strongest when properly healed. Thunder stood peacefully in his paddock, a living testament to the power of patient love. The wounded colt grazed contentedly, its scars now marks of survival rather than shame. And in the house beside the stable, a new family began planning their future together, built on trust, healing, and the understanding that true strength came from choosing to care for those who needed protection most. Emma played in the yard with wooden horses Daniel had carved, her laughter mixing with the gentle sounds of the animals they had all saved. And Rebecca knew that her long journey from desperation to hope was finally complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.